Expectations hypothesis. Since the economic mainstream turned to the new neoclassical synthesis, expectations have been a central element of macroeconomic models. According to Peter Tamine, Barry Wigmore, Gauti B. Egerton, and Christina Romer, the key to recovery and to ending the Great Depression was brought about by a successful management of public expectations. The thesis is based on the observation that after years of deflation and a very severe recession, important economic indicators turned positive in March 1933 when Franklin D. Roosevelt took office. Consumer prices turned from deflation to a mild inflation. Industrial production bottomed out in March 1933, and investment doubled in 1933, with a turnaround in March 1933. There were no monetary forces to explain that turnaround. Money supply was still falling, and short-term interest rates remained close to zero. Before March 1933, people expected further deflation and a recession so that even interest rates at zero did not stimulate investment. But when Roosevelt announced major regime changes, people began to expect inflation and an economic expansion. With these positive expectations, interest rates at zero began to stimulate investment just as they were expected to do. Roosevelt's fiscal and monetary policy regime change helped make his policy objectives credible. The expectation of higher future income and higher future inflation stimulated demand and investment. The analysis suggests that the elimination of the policy dogmas of the gold standard, a balanced budget in times of crisis, and small government led endogenously to a large shift in expectation that accounts for about 70 to 80% of the recovery of output and prices from 1933 to 1937. If the regime change had not happened and the Hoover policy had continued, the economy would have continued its free fall in 1933, and output would have been 30% lower in 1937 than in 1933. The recession of 1937 to 1938, which slowed down economic recovery from the Great Depression, is explained by fears of the population that the moderate tightening of the monetary and fiscal policy in 1937 was the first step to a restoration of the pre-1933 policy regime. Common position. There is common consensus among economists today that the government and the central bank should work to keep the interconnected macroeconomic aggregates of gross domestic product and money supply on a stable growth path. When threatened by expectations of a depression, central banks should expand liquidity in the banking system, and the government should cut taxes and accelerate spending in order to prevent a collapse in money supply and aggregate demand. At the beginning of the Great Depression, most economists believed in Say's law and the equilibrating powers of the market and failed to understand the severity of the depression. Outright leave-it-alone liquidationism was a common position and was universally held by Austrian school economists. The liquidationist position held that a depression worked to liquidate failed businesses and investments that had been made obsolete by technological development, releasing factors of production, capital and labor, to be redeployed in other more productive sectors of the dynamic economy. They argued that even if self-adjustment of the economy caused mass bankruptcies, it was still the best course. Economists like Barry Eichengreen and J. Bradford DeLong note that President Herbert Hoover tried to keep the federal budget balanced until 1932, when he lost confidence in his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and replaced him. An increasingly common view among economic historians is that the adherence of many Federal Reserve policymakers to the liquidationist position led to disastrous consequences. Unlike what liquidationists expected, a large proportion of the capital stock was not redeployed but vanished during the first years of the Great Depression. According to a study by Olivier Blanchard and Lawrence Summers, the recession caused a drop of net capital accumulation to pre-1924 levels by 1933. Milton Friedman called leave-it-alone liquidationism dangerous nonsense. He wrote, "I think the Austrian business cycle theory has done the world a great deal of harm. If you go back to the 1930s, which is a key point, here you had the Austrians sitting in London, Hayek and Lionel Robbins, and saying, you just have to let the bottom drop out of the world. You've just got to let it cure itself. You can't do anything about it. You will only make it worse." I think by encouraging that kind of do-nothing policy both in Britain and in the United States, they did harm. Heterodox theories, Austrian school, two prominent theorists in the Austrian school on the Great Depression include Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and American economist Murray Rothbard, who wrote America's Great Depression, 1963. In their view, much like the monetarists, the Federal Reserve, created in 1913, shoulders much of the blame. However, unlike the monetarists, they argue that the key cause of the Depression was the expansion of the money supply in the 1920s, which led to an unsustainable, credit-driven boom. In the Austrian view, it was this inflation of the money supply that led to an unsustainable boom in both asset prices, stocks and bonds, and capital goods. Therefore, by the time the Federal Reserve tightened in 1928, it was far too late to prevent an economic contraction. In February 1929, Hayek published a paper predicting the Federal Reserve's actions would lead to a crisis starting in the stock and credit markets. According to Rothbard, the government's support for failed enterprises and efforts to keep wages above their market values actually prolonged the Depression. Unlike Rothbard, after 1970, Hayek believed that the Federal Reserve had further contributed to the problems of the Depression by permitting the money supply to shrink during the earliest years of the Depression. However, during the Depression, in 1932 and in 1934, Hayek had criticized both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England for not taking a more contractionary stance. Hans Zenholz argued that most boom and busts that plagued the American economy, such as those in 1819 to 20, 1837 to 1843, 1857 to 1860, 1873 to 1878, 1893 to 1897, and 1920 to 21, were generated by the government creating a boom through easy money and credit, which was soon followed by the inevitable bust. Ludwig von Mises wrote in the 1930s, "Credit expansion cannot increase the supply of real goods. It merely brings about a rearrangement. It diverts capital investment away from the course prescribed by the state of economic wealth and market conditions. It causes production to pursue paths which it would not follow unless the economy were to acquire an increase in material goods. As a result, the upswing lacks a solid base. It is not real prosperity. It is illusory prosperity. It did not develop from an increase in economic wealth, that is, the accumulation of savings made available for productive investment. Rather, it arose because the credit expansion created the illusion of such an increase. Sooner or later, it must become apparent that this economic situation is built on sand. Marxists generally argue that the Great Depression was the result of the inherent instability of the capitalist mode of production. According to Forbes, the idea that capitalism caused the Great Depression was widely held among intellectuals and the general public for many decades. Inequality. Two economists of the 1920s, Waddell Catchings and William Trufant Foster, popularized a theory that influenced many policymakers, including Herbert Hoover, Henry A. Wallace, Paul Douglas, and Mariner Eccles. It held the economy produced more than it consumed because the consumers did not have enough income. Thus, the unequal distribution of wealth throughout the 1920s caused the Great Depression. According to this view, the root cause of the Great Depression was a global overinvestment in heavy industry capacity compared to wages and earnings from independent businesses such as farms. The proposed solution was for the government to pump money into the consumers' pockets. That is, it must redistribute purchasing power, maintain the industrial base, and reinflate prices and wages to force as much of the inflationary increase in purchasing power into consumer spending. The economy was overbuilt and new factories were not needed. Foster and Catchings recommended federal and state governments start large construction projects, a program followed by Hoover and Roosevelt. Productivity shock. It cannot be emphasized too strongly that the productivity, output, and employment trends we are describing are long-time trends and were thoroughly evident before 1929. These trends are in no wise the result of the present depression, nor are they the result of the World War. On the contrary, the present depression is a collapse resulting from these long-term trends. Professor King Hubbard, the first 3 decades of the 20th century saw economic output surge with electrification, mass production, and motorized farm machinery, and because of the rapid growth in productivity, there was a lot of excess production capacity, and the work week was being reduced. The dramatic rise in productivity of major industries in the U.S. and the effects of productivity on output, wages, and the work week are discussed by Spurgeon Bell in his book Productivity, Wages, and National Income, 1940.